Well, for the next few weeks, I want to do something that's a little different from what I've normally done on Sunday mornings. I want to do a character study. I haven't done a character study, and I've been thinking about this one for quite a while. I want to look at the life of Joseph from the Old Testament. I've titled the series Joseph, a series of unfortunate events. At the end of the story, we find Joseph is a very successful man. He's second in command over the whole land of Egypt, which at that time was the wealthiest and most advanced kingdom in the world. But how he got there is not the typical way that most people think that someone rises to power. The beginning of his life was one unfortunate event after another. It seems like his life kept going from bad to worse. Last week we talked about people that have made incredible comebacks. Joseph is one of those comeback stories. At any point in his life, he could have given up. He was handed a lot of things that he didn't deserve. No one would have blamed him if he had a meltdown, if he had become a mass murderer or committed some kind of heinous crime. A good attorney could have got him a light sentence by claiming that he was guilty by reasons of insanity, or he was only guilty because of the way society had treated him. It's easy to blame everybody else for our problems. We love to excuse our actions by pointing out what someone else has done to us. If our parents would have done things differently, then I wouldn't be the way I am. If our siblings would have done things differently, if only my boss would treat me better. We make all kinds of excuses, but none of those excuses really hold water. We are responsible for our own choices. Joseph is proof that we don't have to let our circumstances turn us into monsters. The world may not always treat us the way we deserve to be treated. In fact, most of the time, they won't. So quit waiting for the world to treat you better. It's not going to happen. Regardless of what life has dealt us and how we've been treated, we can still make right choices. We are responsible for our own actions. We don't have a lot of control over the things that are handed to us. Sometimes, like Joseph, it seems like we're given more bad than good. Joseph's life seemed to keep going from bad to worse, but he loved God. And in the end, God took all of those things, all of those bad things, and turned them around and turned them into something good. Today, I want to look at Joseph's heritage. I want to look at his family tree. There's a lot of talk today about dysfunctional families. Psychiatrists say that one of the most common dynamics in dysfunctional families is children grow up and repeat the same patterns they saw in their dysfunctional parents. Each generation adds one more link to a dysfunctional chain. It seems unbreakable. Although statistics do seem to show that in most cases that is true, there are exceptions to the rule. Dysfunction usually breeds dysfunction. Health usually breeds health. But I know people that have come from very strong, healthy families that have become dysfunctional. I also know people like Joseph. Of course, I didn't know Joseph, but I've read about Joseph. But I do know people in real life who have come from dysfunctional families that have turned things around, and they have become successful because they said, I'm going to break this chain. It stops here. There are people from dysfunctional families who have left a new legacy to their own children. Joseph is one of those people that broke the dysfunctional chain. He left a truly godly heritage to his own kids. Now, some of you might be saying, now, wait a minute. Wasn't Joseph's father, Jacob, the father of the whole Israelite nation? Wasn't his great-grandfather, Abraham, the one who's called the man of faith, the one who started everything? How can you say his family was dysfunctional? Yes, his family had good things, but if you look at their lives, they were far from perfect. Abraham was a liar. I mean, there were a lot of things that went on there that were not perfect. We're not going to be talking much about Abraham and Isaac in this study, but you can go back on your own and look at the big mistakes they made. They were considered righteous, but they weren't perfect. Far from perfect. Joseph could have said, if I turn out as good as my great-grandpa, I'll be happy. But if we look at what we're told about Joseph, he actually turned out better than his great-grandpa. He turned out better than Abraham, the father of faith. Even though his ancestors have been liars, idolaters, adulterers, and thieves, Joseph broke that chain. Joseph has been compared by many theologians to be the Old Testament parallel to Jesus Christ. One theologian in particular, Arthur Pink, finds no less than 101 connections between Joseph and Jesus. Let me just name a few. Both Joseph and Jesus were innocent and paid for crimes they didn't commit. Now, I'm sure that Joseph wasn't perfect, but in the narrative of Joseph in the Bible, we're never told of any sins that Joseph committed. He must have because he was human, but we're never told any of his sins. We are told of many sins committed by Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but none from Joseph. Both Joseph and Jesus were chosen and loved by their fathers. Both of them became slaves. Jesus by choice, Joseph by force. Both were cast between two criminals and pronounced death to one and salvation to the other. Joseph was rejected by his brothers, just like Jesus was rejected by the Jews. Jesus was also rejected by his own brothers. We told that in the story. Even his own brothers rejected him. Both chose to forgive those that slandered and mistreated them. Joseph went to another place, Egypt, to prepare a place for his family, just as Jesus has gone to another place, heaven, to prepare a place for us. Both took what the enemy intended for evil and turned it into something good. And I could go on and on and on, more than 100 parallels to Jesus in the life of Joseph. Webster's dictionary defines dysfunction as abnormal or unhealthy interpersonal interaction within a group. Now, if it just said abnormal, my family would basically be dysfunctional because we are far from normal. But that's sometimes a good thing because sometimes normal is abnormal and what we think is abnormal is actually the normal. But he goes on to say abnormal interactions within a group. That's what really makes a family dysfunctional, is the interactions between members of that group are not the way they should be. Now, from a Christian point of view, dysfunction goes beyond that. A dysfunctional family can be defined as any family that is not functioning as God intended. Because God invented the family, and he has his own pattern for what a family should be like. So if we are not functioning the way God intended us to function, we are a dysfunctional family in God's eyes. Regardless of which definition of family you want to use, Joseph's family definitely falls into that category, in that description. Joseph's family was more messed up than just about any other family in history. His father was a very successful man. But everything he had gotten dishonestly. He stole the birthright or inheritance right from his brother. You can read about that in Genesis 27. He built a large herd of sheep, goats, camels, and donkeys, but he stole them from his uncle Laban. You can read that in Genesis 30. His father Jacob had 4 wives. 2 of them were sisters, Genesis 29. Only one of them was a wife by choice. The other one he had been tricked into marrying. Needless to say, Jacob loved one of his wives more than the other, and she was his favorite. Genesis 29:34, in fact, suggests that Jacob didn't love Leah at all. We read in Genesis 29:31, when the Lord saw that Leah was not loved, he enabled her to conceive, but Rachel remained childless. Now, this is where the other 2 women come in. A man's worth in society in those days was largely determined by how many sons he had. Leah tried to win the love of her husband by having children. Genesis 29:30 says, Leah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Reuben. For she said, it is because the Lord has seen my misery. Surely my husband will love me now. She conceived again. When she gave birth to a son, she said, because the Lord heard that I am not loved, he gave me this one too. So she named him Simeon. Again she conceived, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, now at last my husband will become attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons. So she named him Levi. She conceived again, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, this time I will praise the Lord. So she named him Judah. And then she stopped having children. When Rachel saw that she was not having any children, she became jealous of her sister. So she said to Jacob, give me children or I'll die. Jacob became angry with her and said, am I in the place of God who has kept you from having children? Then she said, here is Bilhah, my servant. Sleep with her so that she can bear children for me. And I too can build a family through her. So she gave her servant Bilhah as a wife. Jacob slept with her, and she became pregnant and bore him a son. Then Rachel said, God has vindicated me. He has listened to my plea and given me a son. And because of this, she named him Dan. Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, I have had a great struggle with my sister, and I have won. So she named him Naphtali. When Leah saw that she had stopped having children, she took her servant Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, what good fortune. So she named him Gad. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. Then Leah said, how happy am I? The women will call me happy. So she named him Asher. So here we have a man with 4 wives, 2 of whom are sisters, which would be dysfunction enough if you just stopped right there. Can you imagine having your sister also married to your husband? Talk about dysfunctional. But then he has 2 others. He's got 4 wives. 3 of his wives are in his mind just baby factories. And the one that he really wants to have children with up to this point has been unable to give him children. Each time a son is born, the son essentially becomes a trophy and gives the mother bragging rights. But the story gets even worse. The competition to have children gets so fierce that the women actually start bargaining with each other and fighting over whose turn it is to sleep with Jacob. Genesis chapter 30, starting at verse 14. Says, during the wheat harvest, Reuben went out into the fields and found some mandrake plants. This is Rachel's son, which he brought to his mother Leah. Leah's son. Rachel said to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. But he said to her, wasn't it enough that you took away my husband? Will you take my son's mandrakes also? Very well, Rachel said, he can sleep with you tonight in return for your son's mandrakes. So when Jacob came in from the fields that evening, Leah went out to meet him. You must sleep with me, she said. I have hired you with my son's mandrakes. So he slept with her. What are you laughing about? This is not a funny story. This is a sad story. God listened to Leah. She became pregnant, bore Jacob a 5th son. Then Leah said, God has rewarded me for giving my servant to my husband. Yeah, I'm sure that was God's reward. So she named him Issachar. Leah conceived again, bore Jacob a 6th son. Then Leah said, God has presented me with a precious gift. This time my husband will treat me with honor, because I have borne him 6 sons. So she named him Zebulun. Sometime later, she gave birth to a daughter and named her Dinah. Then God remembered Rachel. He listened to her and enabled her to conceive. She became pregnant, gave birth to a son, and said, God has taken away my disgrace. She named him Joseph and said, may the Lord add to me another son. And this is where we start the story of Joseph. Some of you thought your families were dysfunctional. This story makes your family look normal. This story is better than anything you'll see on Jerry Springer or Dr. Phil. The sleaziest soap opera is pale in relation to this story. And you guys thought the Bible was a boring book. That's the home that Joseph grew up in. 4 women, 2 of them sisters, all fighting over who gets the most attention. He was raised in a household with 4 angry, jealous, insecure, unhappy women. Supposedly, Mark Twain was once giving a lecture in Utah, and he got into a debate with a Mormon over polygamy. The Mormon dared Mark Twain to show him in the Bible where it says polygamy is wrong. Mark Twain responded, Jesus said, no man can serve 2 masters. I'm sure you've heard the saying, if mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. In Joseph's family, it was, if all 4 mamas ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. So nobody was ever happy in Joseph's household. It wasn't just the 4 women that were in competition with each other. Joseph also had 10 half-brothers that couldn't get along with each other and were constantly fighting. In fact, the only thing these 10 brothers seemed to agree on was they all hated Joseph, which we're going to get to in just a moment. With 4 wives, I have to wonder how Jacob ended up with only 12 sons instead of 112. Maybe he's like the man that had 4 boys. Named them Eenie, Meenie, Miney, and Melvin. Yeah, just like you, somebody thought that was kind of weird. Melvin didn't seem to make sense with the other ones. So they asked him, they said, why did you break the pattern? You got Eenie, Meenie, Miney. Why did you name the 4th one Melvin? He said, well, if you had 4 sons and they all turned out to be scoundrels like my sons, you'd make a decision too. You definitely don't want no Mo. Besides these 10 half-brothers, Joseph also had 1 half-sister named Dinah. And by the time we get to Genesis chapter 37, Jacob and Rachel have Jacob's only full sibling, Benjamin. But Rachel died giving birth. And Joseph is now stuck with 3 evil stepmothers and 10 evil stepbrothers. I guess we could call him Cinderfella. To make matters worse, his father, Jacob, was a passive parent. It's obvious that he wasn't good at either giving instruction or discipline, and he avoided confrontation at any cost. He also wasn't very good at standing up and defending his children. When his only daughter was raped in Genesis 34, he ignored it, did absolutely nothing. When Dinah's brothers avenged their sister's rape by murdering every male from the town in which the rape was committed, he got angry. But what he was angry about was not that his sons had murdered innocent people. He was angry because they had given him a bad name with the community. Knowing that there was strife and even hatred with his own family towards each other, he never once confronted any of his sons or his wives and tried to bring peace. He just let everybody tell him what to do, and he just did it because he didn't want to get into conflict. Joseph's brothers were immoral. The oldest one, Reuben, even had the audacity to sleep with one of his stepmothers, essentially committing adultery with his own father's wife. This was a dysfunctional family. Again, it appears that although Jacob knew about it, he ignored it. Not exactly the picture of a normal family, is it? How could anyone grow up good when this is what they're exposed to on a daily basis? Yet Joseph, we will find, was a man of honesty and integrity. Instead of imitating what he saw around him, he chose to break the chain of dysfunction and pass on a godly heritage to his own children. Now, if you have your Bibles and you want to follow along, it will be on the screen. This is where we really pick up our story. That was just the background into the family that Joseph grew up in. We're going to start today with Genesis chapter 37. So if you want to turn in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 37. Let's find out how bad things really are, as if just the dysfunction wasn't enough. This starts to tell us how bad it really was. Genesis chapter 37, starting at verse 1, says, Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Now, I already gave you some of the backstory. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wife. And he brought their father a bad report about them. Now, by this time, Joseph's mom had already died. Joseph is helping care for his father's flocks. He gives his father a bad report about something his brothers are doing. We're not told what it was they were doing. Maybe he reported about his brothers sleeping around or partying when they were supposed to be watching the sheep. Maybe he saw his brothers stealing from their father and building their own flocks. Why not? Jacob got his flocks from his uncle Laban. What would stop the sons from stealing from him? Whatever it was, I'm sure it didn't make his brothers very happy that little brothers tattling on them. His father, on the other hand, once again doesn't appear to do anything to discipline his sons. Joseph gives a bad report, and Joseph, oh, well, thanks for telling me, and just kind of goes on living his own life. It doesn't say that he stopped whatever it was, never once talked to the boys about it. In fact, he seems to be pleased that Joseph's going to keep him informed, so he decides he's going to reward Joseph. He gives him the full-time job of informer. We read about that when we get to verse 12. Now let's go to verse 3. Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons. Why not? He loved one of his wives more than the other wives. Why not have a favorite son too? And besides that, his father came from a family where there were favorites. Jacob was mama's favorite, and Esau was daddy's favorite. So he's used to having favorites. Even Abraham had favorites. He had his favorite son Isaac over Ishmael. So it's kind of a line of let's pick our favorites and let's kind of spoil one child over the other. Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Now, this is one of Jacob's big mistakes, favorites. We know that he favored Jacob because he was essentially a miracle child born to him by his favorite wife, Rachel, after she'd been barren for years. It says he was a favorite because he was born to him in his old age. He may have also been the favorite because he was such a good child. He wasn't a rebel rouser like the other boys. We're not sure whether this story is told in perfect chronological order or not. But it makes sense that this part of the story happened right after Joseph brought back the bad reports from his brothers. Because in verse 2, at age 17, Joseph was tending the sheep with his brothers. That's the last time we ever hear of him tending sheep. He's now given an ornate robe to wear. Now, this type of robe wasn't something to be worn out in the fields to take care of sheep. This type of robe was the kind of a robe that a ruler or a manager would wear. So it appears like Joseph has just been promoted to manager. You're now in charge. You get to check up on everybody, see how they're doing, and give reports. But you don't have to do any physical labor yourself. So you can kind of understand why his father favored him and why his older brothers hated him. It says his brothers hated him so much they could not speak a kind word to him. Not even one kind word. They couldn't think of anything good to say about their brother. It's kind of like the child who says something unkind to his brother. How many have experienced that, having kids? Or maybe it's brother or sister. Say something unkind. Maybe he says something to his sister or his brother. He says, "You're stupid." So mom and dad try to correct him by saying, "That wasn't nice. Tell your brother you're sorry." So the angry child responds back with, "I'm sorry, you're stupid." That's the way it was with Joseph's brothers. They couldn't say anything nice. Even when they tried to say something nice, it came out bad because they hated him so much they couldn't say anything kind. Joseph's brothers hated him so much that they wished he wasn't even there. So Joseph tries his best to make small talk with his brothers. He thinks they might be interested in hearing about a weird dream that he had. So we get to verse 5. Joseph had a dream. When he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. They already hated him. How can you hate somebody more than hating them enough you can't say anything nice to them? Now they hated him more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Now, I've heard people say that Joseph was a tattletale. In fact, I just used the word tattletale a little bit earlier. That he was full of pride and that he had a tendency to brag. But all this could have been innocent on his part. Notice I didn't say smart. I said innocent. Joseph might have really been concerned about his brothers. That might be why he reported to his dad. Maybe they were doing something dangerous. He knew if they head down this path, something good is not going to happen to this. And so out of concern for his brothers, he thought, I've got to tell Dad what they're doing because Dad's got to stop it. That didn't work. Dad didn't stop it. But he may not have just been tattling. He may have actually had concern. The scriptures also doesn't say that when Joseph shared his dreams, he was bragging. It doesn't say Joseph had a dream and he bragged about it to his brothers. It just says he shared it with his brothers. He might have simply been trying to have conversation. It was a weird dream. How many of you have ever shared a weird dream that you had with someone else? When you have a weird dream, it's puzzling. You say, I don't know what this dream means. You're hoping maybe somebody else can interpret for you. Somebody else can come and say, here, let me interpret. In fact, Joseph kind of later on in life got a knack for interpreting dreams, and people came to him to interpret dreams. And so maybe he said, I don't understand what this dream is, but guys, it was really weird. I mean, you're going to laugh at this story. But they didn't laugh. They got mad. It doesn't say he was bragging. He just shared a dream. But knowing that his brother already hated him, he should have known that a dream like this would give them another reason to hate him. So even if it was done innocently, sharing the dream might not have been the wisest thing to do. Verse 9 says, then he had another dream. And he told it to his brothers. Listen, he said, I had another dream. This time the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, what is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Now, knowing how his brothers reacted when he told them about the first dream, why would he tell them about the second dream? Not real bright. At least not at this age in his life. This time, even his father rebukes him. It's the first and only time we ever read about Jacob rebuking any of his sons. And it's not because they've done something bad. It's because he doesn't like the idea of Joseph having a dream about him bowing down to his son. That's not the way it's supposed to be. So his father rebukes him out of jealousy or out of, shame on you because you're trying to say you're going to be in a position above me. I'm the dad. You're the son. That's not true. His dad rebukes him for the dream. But it says his dad did keep the matter in mind. Joseph is now obviously his father's favorite. He no longer has to do any real work. He gets to wear a supervisor's coat while his brothers wear work clothes. He gets to live at home and occasionally travel to check up on the brothers while they're watching the sheep outside. I'm not saying they're right in their hatred, but it's easy to understand why these boys may not be that fond of little brother Joseph. Verse 12. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, as you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I am going to send you to them. Very well, he replied. So he said to him, go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me. Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. Now notice Joseph is not with his brothers watching the sheep. In verse 2, he was watching the sheep. He's no longer watching sheep. Now he's just traveling back and forth, reporting on what's happening. This has probably been a regular occurrence since he was presented with the supervisor's coat. Next verse says, when Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, what are you looking for? He replied, I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks? They've moved from here, the man answered. I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. They hate him so much, they want to kill him. Now, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands. How many of you have ever wanted to strangle your brother or sister? Okay? Because I might get a couple hands. But I'm sure it was passing. I'm sure it didn't last very long. Sometimes our brothers and sisters get on our nerves. And I'm thinking right now about the last part of the Cheaper by the Dozen. Remember the one brother runs away because he thinks nobody loves him and everybody's always making fun of him and criticizing him, and he decides he wants to go back to the old house, so he runs back to the old house, and they come find him, and he's just amazed that his family come looking for him. He thought they would be glad that he was gone, and they come looking for him, and he says, "Why did you come looking for me? I thought you didn't like me." And the sister says, sometime, I don't know the exact phrase, something about, "Sometimes I may want to hurt you," or something like that, which is, I would defend you. These aren't the exact words. I would defend you any day of the week. I might think, because you're aggravating me, that I want to do something and teach you a lesson. But when it comes right down to it, you're my little brother. And I will not let any harm come to you, at least not by anybody else. I may inflict a little bit of pain myself, but don't let anybody else inflict pain. But these brothers are actually plotting. They're going to kill their brother Joseph. We hate him so much, let's get rid of him. Our lives would be better off without him. One problem with a coat of many colors: you can't hide. His brothers saw him coming from a distance. He was still a long ways off. And they said, "Look at that neon sign coming towards us. We know who that is. Nobody else in this part of the country wears something like that. That's Joseph, the dreamer. Let's come up with a plan. So when he gets here, we know how to do him in." And they had plenty of time to plot their revenge. They're going to teach him a lesson. And that's where we have to stop for today. Now, if this was kids' church, all these people go, "Oh, we want to hear the rest of the story." Well, most of you here know the rest of the story. If you really want to know, you can read ahead in Genesis because it's all right there. But you still need to come back next week because you haven't heard the story told the way I'm going to tell the story. Okay? I'm going to give you the story behind the story. So we've got Joseph. His family, how many would agree his family is dysfunctional? His family is so dysfunctional that his brothers want to kill him. But as we continue through this story, we're going to find Joseph, a man who comes from a dysfunctional family, a man who is abused by his brothers. Yet he's going to rise to power and become second in command, basically in the whole world, is basically what it was. Egypt at that time was kind of over everything. So basically, he is like second in command in the whole world. How did that happen? Because Joseph kept his eyes on God. Joseph could have got angry. He could have said, "It's not fair the way I was treated." He could have said, "It was my family that made me this way. It was my brothers that made me this way." He could have been angry with the world. He could have given up on life. He could have even taken his own life. Joseph doesn't understand what's happening to him. But he says, "You know what? My trust is in God. I'm going to keep my faith in God." Joseph was willing to take the bad along with the good. For years, there never seemed to be any good. As we continue through the story, it seems like for the next so many years of his life, there was never a good thing. It's like his life goes from bad to worse. The first part of Joseph's story is a tragedy. It goes from one unfortunate event to another. Life seems to have given him all lemons, no oranges. But in the end of his story, it's a comeback. Because Joseph never let his circumstances get the best of him. And even though Paul had not yet written his epistle, Joseph seems to understand the concept that Paul wrote about in Romans chapter 8. And we know that in all things, everybody say all things. Doesn't say just the good things. We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. The key there is to those who love God. He works for the good, turns all things, even the bad things, he turns them around and he creates something good. It doesn't happen overnight. You say, well, God, I love you. How come you haven't turned it around yet? It took years for Joseph's life to get turned around because God was still working in him. But Joseph kept his faith in God. And God took the dysfunctional family. He took the hatred of the brothers. He took all the things that we're going to read about that happened to Joseph. He took all those things and he put them all together. If you've ever baked a cake, you know there are some ingredients that go in that cake that aren't good if you eat them by themselves. In fact, I did that illustration here, I think a couple years ago. I brought somebody up here, and we kind of tried to bake a cake, and I had somebody come up and taste some of the ingredients, and I gave somebody a mouthful of flour or a spoonful of flour. Not very good stuff, is it? We had somebody try some unsweetened chocolate, because that goes into a chocolate cake. Spit it out. A lot of things that go into that cake are not good. But when you take those bad ingredients and the good ingredients and you mix them all together and then you put it in the oven, out comes a delicious chocolate cake. We need to take some bad in our lives. But if we keep our faith in God, if we don't give up, if we keep trusting, God will take all of that and he will turn it in to something good. We might be facing problems right now. But we can't allow our past to turn us into a monster. We can't blame our past, or we can't blame the choices of somebody else. We can't say, well, if my parents would have done it differently, or if my brothers and sisters would have done it differently, or if my boss would have done it differently. That's an excuse. That's a cop-out. They may not have treated you correctly. They may not be treating you right now. That's their choice. What are you going to do? Are you going to make right choices? Because as we watch Joseph, we're going to see that he continually made the right choice. Even when everybody around him was making bad choices. Even when everybody else was coming against him. He kept doing the right thing. We can choose to break the chain of dysfunction and become victorious through the power of Jesus Christ. I don't know what kind of stuff you're facing this morning. You might have come in here just really discouraged because life has not been treating you that well. And maybe it's something to do with people. You know what? People don't treat you wise. In fact, I've decided a long time ago, life would be perfect if there weren't other people. But you know what? There are other people. People have problems and they bring their problems to you. Maybe your boss is not treating you well. Maybe the other people at work aren't treating you well. Maybe your family's not treating you well. Maybe you come from a dysfunctional family. I doubt if your family was as dysfunctional as Joseph's family. But even if it was, Joseph's proof that you don't have to let that get you down. I don't know what kind of financial trouble you're facing. I don't know what kind of problems you're facing at school. Maybe you got to go tomorrow and you know the teacher's going to talk to you about something that maybe you did or did not do on Friday, but the teacher thinks it was you. It doesn't matter. Keep your faith in God. God will turn your story into a comeback story if you don't give up. God can take dysfunction and turn it into function. God can take problems. He can take negative stuff and he can turn it into positive. God is a miracle-working God. And if you just give him your stuff and say, God, I don't know why this is going on right now, but God, I trust you. I'm not going to deny you. I'm going to keep studying the Word. I'm going to keep on praying. I'm going to keep on attending church so I can get some spiritual training. God, you are my source. I don't like this stuff. But I believe that even the bad stuff is going to be turned around for good. So God, I put my life in your care. Help me to walk through this stuff and turn my life around and give me a comeback story. Bow your head and close your eyes. Heavenly Father, I don't know what kind of problems people in this room are facing. I know some of the problems. People have talked about some of the things they're going through, and I know a little bit about some of the background of some of the people in this room because they've talked to me a little bit about their past. There are some people here that don't come from great family situations. Their families could probably be described as dysfunctional. Again, none of them I've heard so far compared to Joseph's story. But there are some people here that come from dysfunction. There are people here who are going through accusations. They're being accused of things that they didn't do. So did Joseph. So did you. Help us to just say, God, I may not understand what I'm going through right now. I don't understand why I've got these things in my past. I don't understand why I'm going through these things right now. But God, I do believe that you can take the bad. All things work together for good to those that love God. And God, I love you. And I'm going to continue to love you. And I'm going to watch the miracles that you perform as you take what I've got now and you add maybe even some more bad into it. But eventually you start adding some good. And my life is going to turn out great because I have my faith in you. And you don't make mistakes. I am not a mistake. My life is not a mistake. You've got me right where you want me, and you will bring me through. Amen.